For this lecture, we're going to be looking at chapter 21 and 22, specifically looking at the budgeting aspects of this business. We're going to first go over the operating budget, which is what we typically think of when we look at what is in our budget for our food service operation. So, what is a budget? It's a written plan or a prediction for income and expenses. So you're trying to think ahead to predict how much you're going to spend, how much income you're going to make during that period, and try to balance it out. When we look at our operating budget specifically, we're trying to estimate the costs that are incurred in the process of generating our meals. So labor, food costs, supply costs, things like that. Our capital budget then is something that is more longer term. It's a plan for building improvements, new equipment purchases, things that won't be happening every year, but we still need to plan for them because they are essential to running a smooth food service operation. So we're going to start by looking at some things that we're going to do when we are planning an operating budget. So some terms you really need to know for budgeting. First is the fiscal year, and that is the 12-month period for which any budget may apply. This isn't always January to December. A lot of times it may start in July, sometimes it starts in October. It really depends on which type of fiscal year calendar that organization is following. So you have to be aware of when that fiscal year restarts, what things go into budgeting for the next fiscal year, etc. We also have basic terms of revenue, which is money coming in or income, versus expenses, which is money going out or costs that you will incur. So we need to estimate those and try to decide, are they going to balance, are we going to make a profit, etc. Gross versus net is something we'll also look at. So gross is the sum of money before any deductions. So all the money you made in before you deduct food costs, labor costs, etc. And then net is that amount of money that remains after expenses have been deducted. So a company could gross $100,000 for that month, but if they spent $99,000, then their net profit really is only $1,000. So you have to think about all of those when you're really looking at what are these budget numbers we're actually looking at. Is it gross? Is it net? How are they presenting this to us? A break even would happen then when those revenue and expenses are equal. So there's not any profit made, there's also not any loss as well. Some other things you have to think about with food service, especially when we're talking about our non-commercial food service, like healthcare and schools, is external funding or subsidies. So sometimes a lot of our hospital or long-term care or school food service operations aren't getting a lot of revenue in from what's being spent at, say, their cafeteria. A lot of their budget is funded through external sources or even other hospital budgets, that kind of thing. There's some other terminology we're going to look at. So we've talked about this before, but FTE stands for full-time equivalent. And that's the equivalent of one person working 40 hours per week. So it's something we need to look at. How many FTEs do we have? How many do we need? Are we going to have any equipment changes that may affect how many we need? So those are important when you're trying to plan out your labor costs in budgeting. You also have to look at the difference between an exempt employee versus a non-exempt employee. So an exempt employee is an employee who is exempt from overtime pay, so these individuals are salaried, and there is a certain threshold that if they make over this amount of money, and that changes, it has recently changed from the federal level, then they do not get paid overtime. They're not eligible for overtime, they're just on their salaried level. A non-exempt employee then is someone who is not exempt from overtime pay, and that individual must be paid overtime. And some of this, there is that level set because what they're trying to prevent are companies from making, someone a manager at $15,000 a year and requiring them to work 80 hours a week. So they're really trying to keep that difference between exempt and non-exempt to make sure that our employees who are getting a lower salary, lower wage, are getting overtime pay. Some other things to think about specifically for a healthcare type facility is a census. You need to use this to budget how many meals you're going to need to prepare a day by knowing the approximate number of clients or patients on a given day. Now, the census isn't the same for day to day, but sometimes we can get a good idea by looking at, hey, we're looking at November now. What was the census last November in this hospital? Because things can change different times of the year. If we have different surgeries going on, things like that. So it's best to have a good guide, a census that you can use to estimate about how many meals you think you'll serve in a given week or month or year. Some other things you can calculate include cost per meal, and that would be getting your total food, supplies, and labor cost, calculate that, divided by the number of meals served. So you can see how efficient are we and how much does it cost us per meal that we're serving to our clients. You can also look at food cost percentage. And this is something that we also do in restaurant side as well. So what's our revenue coming in and what's our food cost percentage? So something to look at. So how do you develop a budget? So obviously there are tons of factors we have to look at, but the first thing you want to know is what are the objectives of the budget for this facility? What are we wanting to think about? Are there any changes going on? Are we going to completely change meal service style? Are we going to need more labor, more food costs? What do we think is going to happen? You may need to break the budget down into sections. So you may have the public cafeteria service separate from the patient meal service. That way you can kind of see where that's at. The public cafeteria, you're going to get a lot more revenue in where you may not in the patient meal service, so you may want to keep those separate. In the example that we're doing in class as a homework assignment that you're going to be looking at, you may kind of look at that it's all lumped in one. So the food cost compared to the revenue comes in may look quite off because you're not getting revenue from most of the meals served just from the public cafeteria meals. You want to then estimate your revenues. How much do I think I'm going to bring in? And the best way to do this is to look at what's happened in the past, or you can look at similar types of facilities in your area to see what their revenue is, to try to get a good, realistic idea of how much money you think you're going to bring in. And then you want to also estimate your operating costs. What are your food costs, labor costs going to be, that kind of thing. When you're looking at revenue as well, like in a school food service, they can look at that as far as this is how much I know I'm going to be reimbursed per meal. And, look at that with revenue and then add that into, obviously, the other things they're going to sell, what other revenue they think they're going to generate, and kind of combine that to figure out where they want to be. Again, the previous year or month's budget can be a really good starting place. Definitely use things that are changing as a way to, alter it a little bit, but that can be a great place to start. So some examples of calculating costs. And there are several ways to do this. Let's look at the inventory method here. And again, you can look at this in more detail in your book, and I would encourage you to do so. So the inventory method, you want to look at your beginning inventory. So how much food, if we're talking about food, you could also do this for looking at supplies, chemicals. But what's your beginning inventory in a dollar amount? What did you purchase throughout that month? And then what is your ending inventory? And if you look at figure 21.5, it gives you an example. So if your beginning inventory was $18,345, you purchased a little over $15,000 throughout that month, and your ending inventory was a little over $21,000, then your monthly food cost total was $12,500. So that gives a great example of how you would calculate that, how much you spent during that month, knowing your beginning and ending inventory, and then anything you spent in between there. When you look at your food costs as a percentage of sales, then you can look at here, this operation spent, again, that $12,500 on food. They had a little over $33,000 in sales. And so their food cost is about 37.6% of their total sales. So it's something you can look at to try to see how you're doing. Again, this is really important for all food service operations to look at. Again, doesn't really matter how much revenue you're making if your expenses are really high. So you have to think about those things as well. You can also then look at a couple other things. So you can look at raw food costs per patient per day. So I can say I know I spent $12,500 last month on food. I had 3,000 total patient days, which isn't necessarily, you didn't have 3,000 patients, but you had, 3,000 days of patients that you were serving in there. 4.17 would be your raw food cost per patient per day. So that's so every patient that was in your facility, you spent about $4.17 on for food costs per day. So that can give you an idea, especially then if you're going to up that. So this would be a really good way to take that number and then say, wow, we're going to have a lot more patients coming in. We're opening a new wing, etc. So what do I need to do? How do I adjust that raw food cost per patient day if I know I'm going to have 4,000 patient days next month? So keep those things in mind. Raw food cost per meal is really the same concept of that per patient day, except for instead of just dividing by the patient day, you're dividing by the total meals served. So you're assuming 3,000 total patient days. So dividing, multiply that by 3 if I'm serving breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So per meal then, that breaks down to about $1.39. Some other things you can look at, you can do this with meal equivalents. So you can calculate the estimate number of meals prepared. And different facilities will do this differently. How many clients do you have? How many meals are you serving? You also need to think about snacks. Do special tube feedings or other things like that run through your budget that you need to plan for? Are you responsible for providing the snacks to the nursing units? All those things need to be taken into account when calculating the costs as well. Some organizations will use a recipe method. Well, they will figure out the cost of the recipes for their cycle menu, so they know, the first week 1 Monday costs, that dinner costs $1.97. Their dinner for week 2 Monday costs $2.50, and whatever that looks like, so they can cost out that recipes for that cycle menu that way as well. There are several tools that you can use to look at these. There's also a menu cost report that can help you determine the cost of menus, and you can see more about that in figure 21.6 and 21.7. So that gives you, some ideas of what that may look like. You may be able to look at your menu for different diets, especially this can be a little bit helpful. Figure out, all right, regular diet versus diabetic diet versus clear liquid diet, because not every individual patient, especially in a healthcare facility where you're going to serve different types of diets, is going to cost the same amount per meal. So those are some things you can take that into account. So this one breaks it down if you're looking at figure 21.6. A 6-ounce orange juice costs about 31 cents. 4 ounces of skim milk, about 17 cents. And even breaks it down to a jelly packet at about 4 cents. So those are some things to keep in mind when you're figuring out, all right, this is what's served with this menu, this is what's served with this menu, and that'll help, especially if you have a ton of varied diets. You may know that I may spend more on certain individuals than others. And then you can estimate about how many people are on each diet, and that can be helpful to figure out your costs. A lot of times your labor costs are often higher than food costs as well. So that's something that a lot of individuals forget, or it's easy to put off to the side. And then when they're looking at their total revenue, that may be okay compared to their food costs, but their labor costs were much higher. This gives you a insight into that 21.6, 21.7 that I just mentioned, so you can look at how the different types of diets may cost more. So again, that menu cost report can be a helpful tool. And you don't just have to use one type of costing only. You can kind of play with some different ones, see what works for you and your operation as well. So what do we think about with labor costs? So, you have salary and you also have benefits. Benefits are one a lot of times I see people leave out. This is how much I'm going to pay in salary, but benefits can be a significant portion of your labor costs, and so it's something you really have to budget for as well. And obviously your salary and benefits that you're going to offer an individual are going to be based on their experience, the type of employee that you need. So all those things are going to come into play. You obviously, should determine your staffing needs and then develop a budget for those costs. But sometimes that may not happen. Sometimes you may just be given a flat budget and you have to work your staffing needs into that. So when we're looking at labor cost per meal, it's, a similar concept to food cost per meal, but you want to take your total labor cost. So let's say for this example, it was a little over $512,000. And this organization served a little over 191,000 meals. And so you're going to divide that. And you ended up with $2.68 of labor cost per meal. So you may have a goal of where you want to hit that as well. You also have to think about part-time versus full-time staff. That may change benefits offered, may change rate of pay. So when you're planning, you really want to think your labor costs through. This gives an example of some things to think about as well. If you know that you have 6 full-time cooks, like this talks about here, working 40 hours a week, making $16 an hour, you can see their salary then is going to be about $3,800 for that week. Then you have to think about benefits. So the benefits for these full-time individuals average out to about 30% of their salary. So then I'm going to take 30% of that weekly total wages for these individuals, and I'm going to add that into their total labor cost. So my total labor cost for the full-time cooks is almost $5,000 for that week. I'm then going to have to add in our part-time cooks. So we have some 8 cooks that work about half-time. They make a little bit less per hour. So we'll calculate what that wages are, and then the benefits, they're part-time, they have less benefit offering, so that's only 20% of their total wages. And then we're going to again add that together. So you can see the total labor costs for these 14 individuals is $7,600 a week. So you have to think about that, how full-time, part-time, what are salaries. And it's probably not going to be just this cut and dry, right? Probably all of your full-time cooks don't make exactly $16 an hour. There is going to be discrepancy. But you have to plan for these things. Think about what budget percentage you'll need to set aside for benefits. Make sure all those things are thought through. Some other things you also need to think about, you may need to work with human resources to set realistic salaries. There are a lot of firms and other resources that you can find out to see what really should I be paying a quality individual in this position. You also may need to work with labor unions, and they also may decide what benefits are offered, things like that. So that is an important thing to think about. Again, just for a definition, that union is an organization of workers intended to represent their coworkers in a labor agreement. And a lot of times we have collective bargaining here, which is the term that generally refers to that communication between union representatives and the administration officials at a given organization. So some things you're going to need to think about when looking at labor costs, salary, benefits, etc. So we're going to quickly talk about the capital budget. So again, these are those big items that exceed a normal finance defined limit. So sometimes you may have anything over $5,000 for equipment, or $10,000, or whatever that's going to look like for your facility is going to go into the capital expenses. And again, this is going to have an expected use longer than the general operating budget. So this isn't something that you're throwing away. It's something that's going to last for several years. A lot of these are typical large kitchen equipments, stoves, food processors, freezers, even software and computers can be on these. Dining room tables, any renovations. Hopefully you're not having to renovate your kitchen every year, so it's not a budget line item. So these are things that we want to plan for. Sometimes it can be difficult. You don't always know when something's going to break, etc., but you want to plan for that in your capital budget. Hey, the dishwasher's getting a little old. I think we should plan to replace that in the next year or two, because we're afraid that it's gonna break on us. So we need to think about that. And keeping an equipment log book or repair log can help kind of estimate. All right, the life of these dishwashers is normally about 10 years. We're at about 9, so let's be thinking about where we might want to put that in our budget. So a lot of things you need to look at: the age of the equipment. Are there any leaks, problems, costs associated? Some things, and this goes down to the cost of repairs and cost of maintenance as well, But there's some things that are, if it's a little fix that, this may break often or every 6 months, we need to call someone in to do maintenance on this, but it's fairly inexpensive and the new equipment would be very costly, and it may be worth continuing to move forward on. But if the repairs are really costly, is it in our best interest to just buy a new version of this equipment? You also have to look at disposables. So, what is the cost of anything that's used to make, is there a detergent that has to go with it that's very expensive, or, certain things like that you want to think about that may be costing a lot, that if you could go to a different version that didn't need that, it may save money over time. So those are things that you're really wanting to think about. And we'll really look at a cost-benefit analysis with these. So compare the relative value of upgrading a piece of equipment with the downtime and cost of repairs that you would see if you were just repairing it. So we'll look at that. You also look at your return on investment. So what's the length of time it takes to get your money back for an investment? And sometimes we'll even look at energy efficiency with some of these, or water usage. Hey, if we can get a new dishwasher that uses 60% less water, how long would it take us to save water costs to get our money back from that investment? Same thing with energy use. So there's a lot of factors that are at play when trying to decide if it's worth it. So that is all we have for budgeting.